Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Around the Empire podcast is listener-supported, independent media. Please pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. Also, please like, share, and subscribe on the YouTube channel. Ben Norton joins us today. We talk about the latest developments in Bolivia as a follow-up to our previous podcast, about life in Nicaragua, the new Cold War with Russia and China, and we wrapped up with the discussion about big picture geopolitics. Ben Norton is a journalist, a writer, and a filmmaker. He's the assistant editor at the Grayzone, and he's the producer of the Moderate Rebels podcast, which he co-hosts with Max Blumenthal. We recorded this on August 20th, 2020. Ben Norton's here talking to us from Nicaragua. Hello, Ben. Thanks so much for taking the time to come back on the show.
Very glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
So you're in Nicaragua. Today we're going to talk about Bolivia and Nicaragua. I really want to take the opportunity. Ben's been following Bolivia. I don't know of another American independent media that is following it as closely as he is. And also, I'm going to refer everybody back to a previous interview that Ben and I did where you could get more background. If you're not caught up on this topic or you don't know the country that well and you want some more, some more conversational detail on that, then you should go to our previous episode and you can find that in the show notes. So we're going to do an update on that, and then we're going to, as I said, take advantage of the fact that Ben lives in Nicaragua now. I knew you were there. I'm not sure if I knew you lived there, long term. So you're really getting to be expert on that country, and I really want to pick your brain on that a little bit too. But I think it's probably easier to start with Bolivia because we can just do updates. I have to admit that I have not kept up with it as well as I was following it pretty closely in real time. It's been 3 more months, so it's been like 9 months since the coup when Evo Morales had to step down, and the election was, the OAS said, threw some shade on the election process, and that's about all I know about what has happened since then. Ben, do you want to sort of catch us up?
Absolutely. There's a lot that's happened, and at the same time, unfortunately, politically, there's not that much that's happened in the sense that the coup regime is still in charge, which is a blatant violation of what its ostensible purpose was from the beginning, right? Because if we go back to November, of course, the military coup took place in November 2019. And what happened was there were a lot of things happening in a few days. And what happened was Jeanine Áñez, who was a very extreme, obscure, far-right lawmaker, like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, she was very, very widely despised, even among the people who knew her, because very few people even knew who she was. And her party got around 3% of the vote in the election. But what happened was the coup regime, led by the military, the coup leaders purged all of the people above her that would be in the chain of command to be bestowed head of state powers, right? So the president and VP, of course, were both kicked out of the country, and then the series of other officials above her were purged. That was the justification that the coup leaders used to bestow upon her the powers of a so-called interim president. And her only obligation, her only duty, according to the Constitution, was to organize a new election.
Right.
So now here we are over half a year later, and she has not organized a new election. In fact, her coup regime has delayed the election 3 times.
Oh, surprise, surprise. Sorry.
Exactly. And we can talk more about the negotiations over the new election, because that's a key fact going on. That's a key, demand among the protests going on now. But what's incredible is that this was supposed to be a short-lived transitional government. If you listen to the OAS, if you listen to the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, the way they talked about it, they said Jeanine Áñez is the interim leader. She's not going to govern in any way. She's just going to organize new elections. That was, many of us at the time were saying that was clearly a lie. And here we are over half a year later, and politically, in terms of the coup regime, the same people are in power. All they've done is further crack down, further solidified their control. And then I can talk about they've brought in some of the most extreme right-wing elements of Bolivian society into the coup regime.
Oh, okay. So this interim government has grown since we last talked.
A little. So specifically, the ministers have changed around Jeanine Áñez. Jeanine Áñez is ostensibly the president, but of course she is at the head of a military junta, and the military is really in charge. And, she does have power, but she also has some very influential ministers now, including in the last interview, I spoke about the role of an important Bolivian Croatian oligarch named Branko Marinkovic. And his name clearly, his name is not Latino. This is a guy who's a descendant of Croatians who fled after World War II. Now, he denies this, but it's widely suspected, and there was a documentary produced alleging that his family members were Nazis who were members of the Ustasha, which was, by the way, of all of the groups that collaborated with the Nazis, one of the most extreme was the Ustasha. These are the Croatian Nazis. And in some cases, actually, there are historical examples of the Nazis telling the Ustasha, like, hey, calm down, you're being too violent even for us Nazis. So what happened is, after the liberation of Yugoslavia by the partisan movement, most of whom were communists and progressive nationalists, under the leadership of Tito, a lot of Croatian Nazis fled to Latin America. And Branko Marinkovic, his family were pretty elite Croatians who fled to Bolivia. And of course, there are many other Nazis and former fascists who fled to Brazil, Argentina, Chile. So this is not unique to Bolivia. But what is unique about Bolivia is that around 2/3 of the population are indigenous. Of course, other countries in Latin America have a very large indigenous population, but Bolivia has one of the largest. So the role of white supremacist, Nazi, fascists forces inside Bolivia is especially noteworthy, because it's not like Argentina, where the majority of the population is more white, right? They're not indigenous people. In Bolivia, there's a very stark difference between the people of European descent, who are based largely in the major city Santa Cruz, and then the indigenous majority. There are, of course, indigenous people in the cities, but many of them live out in the countryside. So Branko Marinkovic, he's a major Bolivian oligarch. He has dual Croatian and Bolivian citizenship, but he was born and raised in Bolivia. But he was involved in numerous coup attempts against Evo Morales and was forced into exile. He fled. Actually, saying he was forced into exile is too charitable to him. He put himself in self-exile because he fled after a failed coup attempt, and the government was going to go after him under Evo Morales and arrest him and try him for trying to assassinate Evo Morales. So he fled the country, and he moved around a bit. He spent some time in the U.S., but where did he end up? Brazil. He ended up in Brazil under Jair Bolsonaro.
Oh, okay.
And in the last interview, I talked a lot about the role of Brazil and Colombia. Of course, we know that the U.S. and the Trump White House played a role in the coup, of course. But in terms of the logistical planning on the ground in Latin America, it was also Colombia and Brazil that played important roles in the coup. And of course, Brazil right now has a far-right fascistic government, and it's widely believed that Branko Marinkovic was in contact with the Bolsonaro government in Brazil. So after the coup, he finally he's allowed back into Bolivia because he's no longer going to be tried for the failed coup before. And now he was brought in as the Minister of Development, which is kind of a catch-all ministry, but he's very powerful in the government.
Yeah, let me guess what the purpose of that is. Privatization
selling off
of
the
all
natural resources.
Yes, of course. Okay. So that's what you were talking about last week. You have a tweet where you're quote tweeting, I don't know how to pronounce, Croatian News, maybe?
Yeah. Croatian News. In fact, I'll make a plug here. I've actually never been to Bolivia. I've spent a lot of time in other countries in Latin America, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Colombia. But so, my knowledge of Bolivia is based on people I talk to in the country, following the reporting. But I would recommend anyone who wants an even more detailed, understanding of what's going on the ground. There's a brilliant Bolivian British reporter named Ali Vargas.
Oh, yeah, I've seen him. Yeah.
Yeah, he speaks fluent English because he's also part British, and he lives in Bolivia. And he helps run this website you mentioned called Croatian News, which is the best English language source for understanding what's happening on the ground in Bolivia.
Great. That's going on my list. I had not seen that one before, but I was following Ali on that. But on the 12th of August, you say, you quote tweet them because they posted a video where they're talking about Bolivia's coup supporters. And I don't know if this is the guy that you were talking about, but the person in the video says, this committee will not rest until these human beasts who are wrongly called citizens are behind bars. And he's referring to the indigenous people who are protesting, which is, a really bad sign, right? This is a very bad sign.
Oh, very, very bad. And that speech, I don't know who the person was speaking because it's not someone in the government, but there are many links to the government. That is a group that's called the Pro Santa Cruz Civic Committee. This is a group that is kind of a stand-in for the oligarch class in Bolivia. I mentioned many of the Croatians who fled to the city of Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz is the major industrial hub of the country. So it's also the richest city, and it's largely dominated by people of European descent, especially the Croatians. And Branko Marinkovic was the former head of the Pro Santa Cruz Civic Committee. Also, Fernando Camacho, who was the kind of muscle behind the coup, he was not in exile. He was still in Bolivia, and he's the one who invaded the presidential palace. And when he took it over with help of the military, he and a pastor next to him kneeled down inside the presidential palace with a Bible and said that. And said that Bolivia no longer belongs to Pachamama, the indigenous Mother Earth spirit. Bolivia belongs to Christ, and Jesus has been restored. Christ has been restored to the temple, to the palace. So Fernando Camacho, the fascist muscle behind the coup, he was also an important member of the pro. He's still involved with, but he was a leader of the youth wing of the Pro Santa Cruz Civic Committee. So that video shows a leader of this committee just shouting racist, just in vitriolic comments, referring to the indigenous people as animals. And this is the same group, by the way. At the Grayzone, you can find, anyone listening at thegrayzone.com, you can find a report that I did with Max Blumenthal, and there's video of members of this committee, this Pro Santa Cruz Civic Committee. There's video of them Nazi saluting. And there's also video of them not only just Nazi saluting, but doing a specific style of European phalangist salute, which the Spanish phalangists used to do, the Francoists. And so this is an explicitly fascist group, and it had previously been one of the most well-connected, economically powerful opposition groups against Evo Morales and his party, the Movement Towards Socialism, based in Santa Cruz. And they actually, by the way, this group, the Pro Santa Cruz Civic Committee, has a history of support from the U.S. Embassy. WikiLeaks documents that we went through show that members of the U.S. Embassy had regular meetings with leaders from this elite Santa Cruz committee, and that they were also involved in a secession campaign because they realized that they were a minority in the country, that the indigenous majority supports Evo Morales. So they thought, well, the only way that we could get power, because the coup keeps failing, the past coup attempts had failed, the only way we can get power is if we secede and turn Santa Cruz into a new country. And the Santa Cruz Civic Committee was funding that campaign, and we now know that the U.S. Embassy was helping them out.
Yeah, it's a little bit, reminds me of Ukraine a little bit. But anyway, yeah, that's really alarming. That's a setup for genocide. Although it's going to be awfully difficult when you're the minority to knock off 2/3 of the population. Let's hope that the numbers are on their side.
Well, and I should also say that, I mean, there has been a lot of violence, but I don't think, fortunately, I don't think that kind of large-scale violence is possible, not only because are they the minority, but they're the minority of a minority. The majority of the population is indigenous, but the Civic Committee doesn't represent the entire non-indigenous population. It only represents the very elite sector of them. But I should also mention that another figure who has become very influential in the coup regime is a minister named Arturo Murillo. And Murillo is very racist. He is not necessarily involved with the Civic Committee in the leadership level, although I'm sure he's got many ties, but he shares that same blatantly racist rhetoric. And he gave a speech in which he referred to the indigenous protesters as dogs and said we have to deal with the dogs. And this is someone who is part of the ministry of the so-called interim government.
A man of God, right? Oh, a minister, a government minister, or a religious minister?
A government minister. He's a government minister.
So the interim government who wants to put off elections some more, if the military's in charge, I guess they can do whatever they want. But the OAS and the bigger countries would have to be sure that they wouldn't be pressured by these larger powers who probably want the same thing. So how are they going to implement this another delay of elections? Do you know?
Well, technically there is now an agreement to have elections, because what happened was the coup regime delayed the elections 3 times, and the last time they delayed the election, there were mass protests across Bolivia that were paralyzing the country. So the coup regime realized that they had to finally give in and agree to elections again, although we'll see if they go through with it, in negotiations with the largely indigenous protests. And what's interesting is that the most recent poll shows that one opposition candidate is slowly becoming a little more popular, but all of the polling since the coup, every single major poll done, has always shown that Evo Morales' party, the Movement Towards Socialism, is always number one. And sometimes the percentage differs, but even the most recent poll that shows the divide between his party and the most moderate opposition candidate, even the most recent poll still shows Luis Arce is the Movement Towards Socialism candidate. He's still leading in all of the polls, which is, of course, why the coup regime has continued to delay and delay. Well,
they've gotten some courts to say that Evo Morales himself is disqualified from running for president, and now he decided he wanted to run for I guess their equivalent of the Senate or another position, and they also disqualified him for that. Aren't they just disqualifying candidates that can win?
Well, of course. I mean, with the case of Evo Morales, it's pretty clear that, he might return to the country if they can manage to overturn the coup government, but the coup regime, but he's not going to return back to the government, but he'll definitely play an important symbolic political role. And we'll see. I mean, there's a similar situation. It's not entirely the same, but in Ecuador right now with Rafael Correa, who was the widely beloved leftist president, and he was also forced into exile. It wasn't through a military coup, but the regime backed by the U.S. in Ecuador of Lenin Moreno has largely purged and exiled and imprisoned members of his party. It's called the Citizens Revolution Party in Ecuador. But the most recent news as of this month, August, is that Correa is going to run as the VP candidate of a presidential candidate.
Oh.
So, I mean, if he's allowed back in the country, although, because if he goes back to the country, the regime of Lenin Moreno is going to try to imprison him. So it's possible that in the future that Evo Morales might try something similar, but I mean, it's at least in this election, Evo Morales is not going to be a candidate.
But he had a strong still has a strong following. Did he groom? I mean, did he have close people around him who, are on the same wavelength with him, who are sort of trustworthy? Maybe that's
absolutely.
a complicated question. I don't know.
Well, no, absolutely. The by far the most popular candidate in all of the polling is Luis Arce, who is from Evo Morales' party. So Arce is, he's very similar politically to Evo Morales. He's not the same kind of unifying figure who's, widely known across the country, but if there were a free and fair election, he's definitely going to win it. And in fact, he's probably going to win it by the 10% threshold needed to win it in the first round, which is, again, why the coup regime continues to delay the elections. So right now, as things stand, I mean, it could change, but today is August 20th. Supposedly, Jani and Áñez is going to be stepping down October 18th, according to the agreement that was made. Now, we'll see if the election actually happens and if she actually agrees to step down. But the polling shows that the Movement Towards Socialism Party is going to win, and the second place candidate will likely be the most moderate member of the opposition, who's named Carlos Mesa. Now, Carlos Mesa is interesting because he actually previously was the leader of the country and was pushed out in massive protests against neoliberalism. And Carlos Mesa is himself he's not at all overtly racist in the way that the other coup leaders are. And in fact, Carlos Mesa was one of the opposition candidates in the last election. I think it's fair to say that Carlos Mesa wasn't really involved in the coup. He's not very popular among the extreme right-wing coup forces, and he represents the kind of the Democratic Party style neoliberal, we're going to privatize things, but we're going to use nice, respectable identity politics language and things like that. He's not the one calling indigenous people animals. And Carlos Mesa is also the candidate that we know that during the Obama administration, they were working a lot with Carlos Mesa. WikiLeaks documents show that he was regularly meeting with the U.S. Embassy. He was the one that the U.S. had been cultivating to be like the replacement to Evo Morales. And then the far right, well, at least before Donald Trump, and then the Trump government comes in and they just take all the gloves off and just go for Cold War style fascist military coups. And Carlos Mesa kind of got pushed aside, and he's back now, so we'll see what happens.
All right. Well, thank you for that update. I appreciate it. Let me just look at my notes real quick here to see if there's something else I want to ask you. Oh, yeah. So the OAS walked back their analysis, their original analysis of the election, right? Now they admit that...
No, they definitely did not. In fact, what happened is the Washington Post published an article by MIT researchers acknowledging that the OAS lied, that there was no evidence whatsoever that, as the OAS claimed, the vote was supposedly, messed with. That the OAS claimed in November, in alliance with the U.S. government, the head of the OAS, Luis Almagro, who is a fanatical right-wing coup monger, a mouth-foaming golpista, he claimed that in the middle of the voting on the voting day in Bolivia, that suddenly the vote count stopped, and then several hours later it came back, and that the MAS party of Evo Morales had suddenly leaped up by a disproportionate number, and supposedly that they were stealing the election. That is totally false, we know now. What actually happened was, if you think about how vote counting works, on the day of the voting, as they were counting the votes that were coming in, the votes in the city, the urban areas, are counted first because it's a more densely populated area, and the votes in the countryside, where Evo Morales has a much larger support base, came in later in the day. So, of course, as the counting went on over the night, the distance between Mas and the other candidates continued to increase. The OAS claimed that they were rigging it. And so anyway, these MIT scientists, they came out and acknowledged what, by the way, many other people had acknowledged well before them, months before them, especially the Center for Economic Policy Research deserves a lot of credit for this, CEPR. But anyway, the point is that the Washington Post finally acknowledged this, and the OAS freaked out, and the OAS released a statement saying that they still stand by their report and that basically those people are liars. It was a really weird statement.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that should have been a fairly well-established pattern for anybody who had followed Bolivia's elections, right? The fact that the rural votes come in later. They knew this. I mean, they knew what was going on. And there had to be a lot of people that understood what was going on. I'm sure they have people who follow elections closely, just like we do. And it's amazing. I had only caught a couple of headlines, and I thought it was, I guess I was too optimistic. I thought OAS had backed down, but apparently not. But I guess it's good that there's a study out there, and there are some people talking about what really happened. There was another thing I wanted to ask you about. Well, we sort of hinted at it already, but in your most recent tweet, you again quote Kausachun. I'm gonna mess it up again. Can you pronounce it for me again?
Yeah. Kausachun.
Kausachun. Okay. Hopefully I remember this time. Kausachun talked about how they say Bolivia's regime is in the process of privatizing the state telecom company, Entel, nationalized by Evo Morales. Investors can now buy shares in what is supposed to be a state company. And you say that, they're now doing, the coup regime's now doing what the U.S. installed it to do. Privatize state assets, sell out the country to foreign capitalists. And you mentioned here that the U.S. and the OAS claimed that this interim government was only supposed to, organize new elections. And here they are, wasting no time in trying to reverse some of Morales's work, and of course, get to the resources. It's hard to watch this happen over and over again. In these countries, they want to control their own resources, and that is just not allowed. And it's really something, And there are people who see this as a good thing, a perfectly good thing. It's almost a religion at this point. So
that's absolutely right, and something that we really need to talk about in these regards is the lithium in Bolivia. So, of course, the coup regime is privatizing many state assets. That's not surprising. That happens with all of these right-wing governments in Latin America. But the very specific case of Bolivia, a lot of it revolves around the lithium reserves, because Bolivia has probably the largest known reserves of lithium in the entire world, or some of the largest. And that had been a very important sticking point and issue in Bolivian politics, because Evo Morales nationalized the lithium and then was using it to fund social programs, to fund development programs for the country. He was making deals, by the way, with China. He also had a deal with Germany, but not with U.S. corporations. And so after the coup, of course, immediately the coup regime starts going after the lithium. Also, Bolivia has significant gas reserves, and they went after the gas and began signing agreements with the Bolsonaro regime in Brazil. And now with lithium, it's become so clear because Elon Musk, who's one of the richest people in the world now, which is insane because his company Tesla doesn't really do that much. They're mostly just like an investment scheme. They produce very little. It's mostly just marketing and investment. But their shares have skyrocketed since the Bolivia coup, and I don't think we can discount the role the Bolivia coup played in helping Tesla's shares skyrocket. And now we see that on Twitter, openly on Twitter, someone responded to a tweet from Elon Musk saying, well, because Elon Musk came out against the U.S. government program to provide unemployment to people because there are 30% of the population is unemployed and there are millions of people who would be starving or be homeless without that assistance. And Elon Musk, of course, one of the richest people on earth, came out saying, oh, no, I oppose this program. It's bad for the American people. And someone responded to Elon Musk and said, you know what was bad for the Bolivian people was the lithium coup in Bolivia. And Elon Musk responded, we will coup whoever we want.
Yeah. That was my last question to you. What's the story with Elon Musk? Yeah, how about it?
Yeah, so, and by the way, when people talk about lithium, we really need to stress, sometimes if you talk about lithium or some of these elements, it kind of goes over people's head. But we need to understand that
batteries.
Lithium is extremely important, exactly, for batteries, for everything, every piece of technology we use. Our phones, our computers, our cameras. By the way, the Green New Deal is going to require a huge amount of lithium to build solar panels, wind turbines. Lithium is extremely important. And now Tesla, which is a massive consumer of lithium, has access to extremely cheap lithium in Bolivia. And, I don't want to be... It's like when people try to say that the war in Syria was just about a pipeline. Obviously, that's a very important factor, and we should look at the geoeconomic and geopolitical factors. There's not just one factor for anything. There's not just one factor for the Syria war, the Bolivia coup. So I'm not saying the Bolivia coup is only about lithium. It was about many things. But definitely the lithium is on the list of the top 5 reasons, and Elon Musk has just exposed it to the entire world.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it was what do they call it? The pink wave that happened. The pink tide that happened in Latin America, where there were a lot of non-complicit governments in power in Latin America. And that clearly had to be changed. It just was not a short-term project. It was a longer-term project. And I think that's always at the top of the list for the reasons why we participate or run these coups. But you're not allowed to not comply, and you're also not allowed to do what you want with your natural resources. They must go into the hands of international corporations, and this is a religious tenet now. This is how it is. So,
well, and we should also keep in mind the difference in how that's expressed between the Obama administration and the Trump administration. I mentioned that the Trump administration has this very neo-colonial ideology guiding it, where you see that numerous members of the Trump administration, including former National Security Advisor John Bolton, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, have invoked the Monroe Doctrine. This is a 200-year-old colonial doctrine in which the U.S. government declared that Latin America is its imperial backyard and that it controls Latin America. And under Obama, of course, there was the infamous military coup in Honduras, although to be fair, that was probably being planned before Obama at the end of the second Bush term. In the Obama years, Obama oversaw many regime change attempts, but his tended to be a smarter form of imperialism that relied, for instance, in the case of Brazil, on a legal coup, on what they call lawfare. And so the Obama administration oversaw pushing out the left-wing Workers' Party of government in Brazil and installing Michel Temer, who was this neoliberal, very similar to Carlos Mesa in Bolivia. These are the neoliberal technocrats. They're not going to say racist stuff, but they're going to privatize everything. And so that was the Obama model, right? And he did the same thing in Paraguay in 2012 in a soft coup, a parliamentary coup against Fernando Lugo there. Well, when Trump came in, it's gloves off. They're not going to pretend to be diplomatic. They're going to go straight for neo-colonial style direct military coups. So you're right that definitely that is the approach. And we can see how the Obama administration paved the way, especially in Venezuela, by beginning the sanctions against Venezuela, paving the way for the Trump administration to take it to ratchet it up to the next level. But regardless of who's in the White House, it's still the policy.
Yeah, there's continuity. They differ in tactics and style, but there's definitely a continuity to these operations. All right, well, we're a half hour in, so it's probably a good time to switch over to Nicaragua, unless there's something else we want to say about Bolivia at this time.
No, let's transition.
All right, so I know even less about Nicaragua than I do about Bolivia, and you live there now. If you would, just tell us what it's like to live there before we get into the politics of it and your latest story on, another plot to overthrow their government. But so what's it like to be in Nicaragua? How long have you been there? What's life like?
Well, Nicaragua is extremely hot. That's the first thing that I'm currently experiencing. But no, I mean, Nicaragua is a beautiful country. In fact, there used to be more tourism here until the 2018 violent coup attempt, which I'll get to in a second, which decimated the tourism industry. But Nicaragua is a gorgeous country. It's right next to Costa Rica. And of course, Costa Rica is a major tourist location for a lot of U.S. Americans, a lot of Canadians. So, Nicaragua is very similar. It has beaches, volcanoes, and it's right in Central America. And it has, even though it's hot, it's got a very nice climate because it's always between like 85 and 95 degrees. So it never gets cold, although it is hot. But now, politically, Nicaragua is even more interesting because Nicaragua is one of the only countries in the region with a socialist government. And the democratically elected government here is run by the Sandinista Front for National Liberation. This is a group that in the 1960s and 70s waged an armed guerrilla struggle, a guerrilla war against a military dictatorship that was a kind of puppet dictatorship of Washington under the military of the general whose name's Somoza. And Somoza's father had started the military dictatorship. It was a family dynasty. And they were trained by the U.S. at the School of the Americas, this infamous U.S. training academy overseen by the Army located in Georgia. And a not-so-fun fact is that the cop, Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd, which kicked off the anti-racist protests in the U.S. in Minneapolis, that cop, Derek Chauvin, had gotten his start at Fort Benning, which is the same U.S. Army base where the School of the Americas is located, which trains all of these Latin American dictators and death squads and such, and drug lords have been trained there in Fort Benning in Georgia. So, there's links going back to the U.S. for a long time. I mean, I don't even have time to go into the even longer history because the U.S. empire has been trying to control Nicaragua for 200 years. I'll just do a very quick summary. I should have started with that, is going back to in the 19th century, the 1800s, many U.S. oligarchs, specifically Cornelius Vanderbilt, the patriarch of the Vanderbilt dynasty, one of the robber barons, he was trying to build a canal through Nicaragua. Later, the U.S. created the Panama Canal, but formerly Nicaragua had been considered as one of the sites of a potential canal. and there were wars in Central America over the attempt to create a canal. And what happened was the U.S. overthrew a progressive nationalist president in Nicaragua and then militarily occupied the country for 30 years in the early 1900s, the early 20th century. And eventually there was an indigenous, I shouldn't say indigenous because a local army, a guerrilla army that rose up in Nicaragua against the U.S. military occupation, led by Augusto Sandino, who was a guerrilla leader. So, long story short, is that he managed to kick out the U.S. military occupiers, but then was eventually killed by the U.S.-backed military coup regime. So, after decades of military dictatorship in the 1960s and 70s, there was a new group, a Marxist guerrilla group, that took its name from Sandino, the Sandinista Front for National Liberation, and they started waging a guerrilla struggle to overthrow the military dictatorship. And, there's a long history there I'm not going to get into. But anyway, the point is that party eventually rebranded and took on a more kind of democratic socialist model and contesting elections. And today, that is the government, the democratically elected government of Nicaragua. And they have accomplished a lot, which I can talk to. I'm going to end this rant here in a second. But it's the only leftist government in Central America, and it's one of the three countries that the U.S. government has targeted as the so-called troika of tyranny. That's Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua.
Right, yeah. Yeah, so what were the years that the Somoza government was, failing, and when were they actually taken out?
Well, the most important date to know is 1979. So that is the date of the victory of the Sandinista Revolution. And that is when the son, Anastasio Somoza, is overthrown. And in Spanish, people use they have two last names, the last name of their father and then the last name of their mother. So the son is Somoza de Baile. So he was overthrown on July 17th, 1979. And then there's the victory of the revolution on July 19th. So July 19th is the day that the Sandinista Front, these Marxist guerrillas, liberated the capital, Managua, and it's celebrated across the country. And I filed a report for the Grayzone. I attended a speech by the president, Daniel Ortega, on the 19th of July. So that's the most important date to know. And then before that, there's the Somoza family. And like I said, that we have to go back to Augusto Sandino. This was the guerrilla leader who led an armed insurgency and successfully kicked out the U.S. military occupation. And then he was killed in 1934. So then what happened is, in the 1930s, Anastasio Somoza Garcia, the father of Somoza de Baile, he established the military dictatorship in the 1930s. So for 40 years, from the 1930s until 1979, the Nicaragua was governed by this family, the Somoza dynasty. And still today, actually, there are descendants of the Somozas and of their National Guard, which was a brutally repressive, very feared state security service. Descendants of them are still members of the opposition today in Nicaragua. And the U.S. government, in fact, during a terror war in the 1980s, in which Washington, the CIA armed and trained death squads known as the Contras, the counter-revolutionaries, many of them had been repurposed who had previously been the members of the Somoza military dictatorship's National Guard.
Yeah, so that's the whole Iran-Contra thing. That's now we're talking about things that are in my adult life that I can remember when they were going on. Just the ranting and raving by Ronald Reagan about, and the praising of the Contras, and it just feels like we're recycling, Ben. It feels like we're going back to those days again. I don't know whether there's a weird Iran-Contra weapons and drugs deal wrapped up in it like there was back then. But, this has just cycled for hundreds of years, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, for 200 years since what was invoked by John Bolton openly, the Monroe Doctrine. And what's interesting about the Iran-Contra affair is that many of the people who were involved in that scandal have been brought back in the Trump administration and are overseeing the new Nicaragua policy, specifically Elliot Abrams.
Yeah, that's
Elliot
crazy.
Abrams is a convicted felon, a war criminal who helped oversee Iran-Contra, and the Trump White House brought him back on, and Elliot Abrams is officially the head of the coup attempt against Venezuela. He's now also the head of the coup attempt against Iran as of a few weeks ago. So not only do we hear echoes of the Reagan administration's obsession with overthrowing Nicaragua, but we actually have some of the same people who were involved in overseeing literal war crimes and torture and murder. They're the same people who are involved in it now.
Yeah, it's still shocking. Elliot Abrams has been around for a while now, but I can remember when he first came, when Trump first brought him into that administration. It was just crazy. And he didn't even like the guy. He was one of the never Trumpers to begin with, and Trump, didn't want anything to do. And then suddenly he's there, and then suddenly he's running a really dumb and botched Venezuelan coup. And, he failed. And here's the thing. Trump, when he talked about that, he was clearly really pissed off at John Bolton and Elliot Abrams at their embarrassing failure, because it was very public and embarrassing. And yet, what happens? The guy essentially gets a promotion. What the heck is going on?
Well, I don't think he was promoted. I think he was moved over to Iran because it was an implicit acknowledgement that the Venezuela coup strategy failed, that they had exhausted all their possibilities short of direct U.S. military invasion, and that the government's not going to fall. So what they're going to do is just use the Cuba strategy, which is just try to starve the country with a blockade for who knows how long. I mean, let's not forget that the bipartisan U.S. blockade has gone on for 60 years now. It began under JFK in 1960. So how long is there going to be a blockade of Venezuela? Who knows? But I think Elliot Abrams was moved over to Iran policy because they tried everything. And by the way, I mean, I said short of a U.S. military intervention, but they did try an invasion of the country, where there actually have been multiple attempted invasions of Venezuela. Most recently in May, what some people have jokingly called the Bay of Piglets, when U.S. mercenaries, U.S. Army, U.S. military veterans who have a mercenary firm, and who were working with at least 50, if not several hundred Venezuelan traders, people who fled their country to Colombia and then were trained probably by the U.S. The U.S., of course, denied involvement, but Venezuela says that the U.S. trained them, these Venezuelan turncoats, in a training camp in Colombia, and then sent them back to try to invade Caracas. And by the way, that was only one of several attempted invasions. There have been other. I mean, that one got more attention because U.S. military veterans were involved, and also because it was just so cartoonishly bad. But there actually have been other attempted invasions, including in November of 2019, there was an attempted invasion across the Brazilian border, and they did manage several of these terrorist forces. They did manage to cross over the Brazilian border and cross into Venezuela, and they attacked a military checkpoint and killed a Venezuelan soldier and wounded another Venezuelan soldier to try to steal their arms so they could use the weapons to try to create a larger guerrilla war. And that didn't work either. But there have been numerous similar attempted invasions of Venezuela. So the fact that Elliot Abrams is moving over, that's just a sign that it failed. And also, I think, you raise a good point. Why is Elliot Abrams in? It's because Trump, who, of course, this guy is very stupid. He's not smart at all. And he also just doesn't care about most other countries. He doesn't care about Latin America. He doesn't care about Iran. Clearly what happened is that Trump realized he had to throw some red meat at the elements of the U.S. national security state, the Pentagon, the CIA, and he said, okay, fine, I'll install these war criminals that you want me to install to oversee foreign policy, and then meanwhile, I can just do what I want domestically. And I think that's probably, because the neoconservative anti-Trump forces, many of them ended up joining his administration. So clearly there was a deal made somewhere in there.
Yeah, no doubt by the big money backers. But the other thing is that...
I don't even think it was the money backers necessarily. I think it was just more the CIA and the Pentagon.
Yeah,
or the people who are really in charge of the government.
Yeah, and they've been at loggerheads, since the election, before the election. But the other thing is, things seem to calm down for quite a while. And this, of course, the attention shifted to the Middle East. But that was also the time when the USSR was collapsing and Russia was on its back foot. Now that Russia and China are, bigger powers, more powerful, more influential, the Latin America crisis, heats up again. And so it does feel like Groundhog Day. It does feel like we are back in the Cold War, and it's, not necessarily a war over one particular thing. It's a broader, not allowing these adversaries of ours to have influence over what we consider, through like you said, through the Monroe Doctrine, to be our backyard, our responsibility, our proprietorship, things like that. Our colonies really is what it boils down to, even if they're different than colonies used to be. But it really does feel like we are cycling back into that. And frankly, it was foreseeable, right? You could see that there were forces who wanted another Cold War, and it looks to me like they've got it.
That's absolutely right. And we should go back and realize, there was a moment that happened early on in the Trump administration that did not get nearly enough attention. In fact, what's so wild to me is that in the past few years, there have been some really monumental shifts in U.S. politics that got almost no attention. And I think that 20, 30 years from now, they're going to be seen as historical watershed moments that are taught in history books. One of them is that the Department of Defense released a new national defense strategy. This is the new the first national defense strategy since the War on Terror, so in over a decade. So this is really marking a shift in how the Pentagon sees its actions abroad. And this was declaring openly, I would argue, the new Cold War. And they said the National Defense Strategy says that according to the Pentagon, the biggest threat, so-called threat to U.S. national security is no longer non-state terrorism, as it was portrayed in the so-called War on Terror. Rather, they said that the biggest threat is great power competition, is the language that it used. And you can find this National Defense Strategy online. There's a short executive summary. It spells it all out. They say very clearly the biggest so-called threats to U.S. national security are China and Russia. And, of course, this Cold War is very different because Russia does not in any way have a socialist government. And China has a mixed government with socialist elements, but it's not the Soviet Union. And so there's definitely that element of the new Cold War, but I think that this new Cold War is in some ways kind of more like World War I. It's not like World War I because it's a totally different historical context. What we're dealing with here is the U.S., after the destruction of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, in 1991, George H.W. Bush, let's not forget, the only president the only former CIA director who ever became president. So George H.W. Bush was the perfect symbol for the new what he declared as the New World Order. In 1991, George H.W. Bush says there is a new world order. And that's not like, there's a lot of conspiracy theories these days, and people talk about the NWO. It's not like that's some cabal of people. No, the New World Order, as this former CIA director turned U.S. president coined it, what he means is that it's unipolar U.S. hegemony. The U.S. is the global empire that controls everything, and there are no other challenges anymore. And that was, I think, the moment of the peak of the U.S. empire, the 1990s, after the Cold War, the first Gulf War, and now we're in a moment where the U.S. empire is clearly rapidly in decline. And I think if you go back and look at this national defense strategy from the Pentagon, I think that's going to be one of those. So, of course, if we had to, I think that document is going to be like a historical bookmark, a watershed moment. And I think if we have to think about the shift in U.S. politics in the past few decades, of course, there's the Cold War, the first Cold War ends in 1991. Then there's this period of, unipolar U.S. hegemony. There's this idea that the Francis Fukuyamas are saying that it's the end of history. And then that comes to an end in 2001 with 9/11. And then there's the war on terror. And then you could say with the election of Trump, I think, that enters the era of the new Cold War. So I really think that we are living in a major historical moment that isn't commented on enough. And there's not just the National Defense Strategy document. There's also a speech that Mike Pompeo just gave several weeks ago at the Richard Nixon Library in California. This got very little attention, but it's so monumentally important. That speech is essentially the declaration of the new Cold War in China. In that speech, Mike Pompeo chose the Richard Nixon Library on purpose, symbolically, because Richard Nixon, of course, oversaw the opening to China. Mm-hmm. Richard Nixon went and met with Mao Zedong, and after the so-called Sino-Soviet split, the U.S. and China actually teamed up against the Soviet Union, and that was one of the main reasons that led to the collapse of the Eastern Bloc. And in his speech at the Nixon Library, Pompeo said that he believes that the Trump Republicans believe that Nixon was mistaken, that he shouldn't have done that because communist China, as he always says, is a threat to all of us. And basically, Pompeo, without stating it explicitly, he implicitly called for overthrowing the Chinese government. And he called for an alliance of Western so-called democracies to team up against the Communist Party of China to overthrow the Chinese government. It was essentially the declaration of the new Cold War, and it got almost no coverage in corporate media.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, there's been a lot of back and forth. I would argue that the new Cold War started with the coup in Ukraine. It was pretty clear what was going on then, but I don't think maybe it was still under dispute about what the strategy going forward was going to be, and certainly it wasn't down in paper like it is now in the defense strategy, like you mentioned. But it was very clear that there was a very strong faction pushing for a new Cold War. At first it looked like they were looking for a new World War, but then it became more clear. Now this is a Cold War, and then you can get into Zbigniew Brzezinski's Grand Chessboard, and then the last thing he wrote before he died was basically a reversal of his previous lifelong strategy, in which he, outlined that that empire, maybe this empire thing is not going to work, and he talks about Russia and China and the U.S. and how a united Russia and China is the last thing that we want, and how we need to, align with one against the other. So, there's been a lot of probably pushing and shoving over this, and there are a lot of Americans, frankly, who are highly invested in China. So I have a more complex, not enough time to go into it, view on China. But this realignment. And here's the thing, going back to your unipolar statement and H.W. Bush and his New World Order thing. back in those days, according to Wes Clark, assuming that we can, that the conversation that Wes Clark has related and has become infamous right now is about, the 7 countries in 5 years. But there's another part to that same speech from Wes Clark. And he didn't just say it in that one video that we see. He was actually out on the campaign trail and he was telling that story. And I heard it in person when he was campaigning for Joe Sestak. And I think this was in 2006. But he also talks about how he visited, oh my God, and now I'm going to drop the name. He went to the Pentagon to visit starts with a W, Bush administration, defense guy. I cannot believe, most
Wolfowitz?
infamous, Wolfowitz. Yeah. Oh God. So he went to visit Wolfowitz at the Pentagon, and Wolfowitz says some things to him that give you a hint of what the strategy was in the early 90s, at least the neocon strategy. It was to that there was a window of opportunity during which we would be the sole superpower. But that was going to be a finite period of time. He understood that. He thought it would be something like 10 years. Well, it's stretched to more than 20 now. But what they wanted to do was he called states
full
like
spectrum dominance.
Well, yeah, but he also talks about getting control of what he called the Soviet client states. I mean, that's how they looked at countries like Iraq, Syria, Libya, Sudan, Somalia, those 7 countries that he laid out, and Iran being the last one on that list, because it'd be the hardest to do. But they were looking at it from the perspective of, we're going to, regain control of what he called Soviet client states, because they knew that within what he thought would be around a 10-year window, that we'd no longer be able to maintain the sole superpower status, that it was unsustainable. At that point in time, they realized it was unsustainable. Sometime between then and now, that seems to have changed. They're like, hey, we like this. We want to keep it. And it was never sustainable, and they realized it at that time, but now they don't seem to, do they?
Definitely not. And what's interesting is seeing there's a kind of political realignment that's been happening with the Trump Republicans and the Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party has been thoroughly embracing these neoconservative forces, including some of the original PNAC people, the Project for a New American Century people, who are the ones who coalesced behind Dick Cheney. And what really happened, I think, in the U.S. with the Bush Jr. administration, I really do think that we have to kind of see it almost as a coup. There was the Patriot Act, which was pushed through, which was thousands of pages long, that had clearly been pre-written, and they were looking for a moment to push it through, and they got that moment with 9/11. And that was the end of civil liberties, and that was effectively the creation of an authoritarian regime in the U.S., which we're still living under. But then there's also the fact that Bush Jr. wasn't really in charge. Dick Cheney, I think, really was in many ways more powerful. And Adam McKay made that that film Vice, but in some ways it's kind of like a documentary. I think it's actually very accurate, and I think he fundamentally got it. He's right that Cheney, who was part of this crew of these hardcore neoconservatives who truly believed in U.S. empire, who had links to U.S. intelligence agencies, who have, of course, very deep corporate links, and powerful corporate interests behind them. They recognized that, that they had this moment, and especially, with 9/11, that gave them an opportunity to exploit it, to push through this authoritarian shift, to kind of coup almost, with the Patriot Act and the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq and the series of endless wars. I mean, the war in Iraq technically ended, but it still hasn't really ended. I mean, Trump just killed, at the beginning of the year, he just killed one of the leading commanders of the Iraqi military. The U.S. is clearly still at war in Iraq. There are U.S. troops in Iraq that refuse to leave, even though the Iraqi parliament voted to kick them out. So, we've been going through a lot since then, but I think you're right to go back and look in the 1990s, and some of these same people who formed the Project for a New American Century, they had this particular vision of full spectrum dominance, and they realized that in order to maintain this empire, they would have to use military force like that. They would have to physically occupy certain parts of the globe, especially in the Middle East, because the Middle East is the center of what, if you listen to geopolitical strategists, and believe me, these neocons love Max Boot, all these people, they love geopolitical strategy. They're not dumb. They are extremely ideological, but they're not dumb. They're war criminals, but they read books. And there's this phrase that you hear going back to the 1800s in geopolitics of the world island.
Yeah.
The world island refers to Eurasia and Africa, which is, the largest landmass. The point is, if you control West Asia, the Middle East, without controlling West Asia, you can't control the world island. If you can't control the Middle East, not just for the carbon reserves. I mean, of course, the oil is very important, but also just physically controlling that area, which is one of the reasons. I mean, Afghanistan's part of South Asia, but it connects South Asia to the Middle East. That area of Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, that is an extremely geopolitically important area, and that's why there was the famous Great Game between the British and the Russian empires before the Bolshevik Revolution, and it was over Afghanistan. It was over that area. So if you these neocons, I think, really understand that. And now what's happening, I think, is that the Republican Party, as Trump has infected it and Trumpism has infected it, we're seeing this realignment where there are elements of Trumpists, some of whom are kind of more isolationists and some of whom still kind of believe in military force. There's this weird hodgepodge, and there's an internal battle happening. But then on the Democratic side, there's no discussion. The Democratic Party has totally embraced that neoconservative foreign policy, and I think that going forward, they're going to continue to embrace it. And those forces that want to save the U.S. empire, they're going to use the idea that the U.S. is the beacon of liberalism and supports feminism and human rights and anti-racism. They've realized that that's the only way they can save the empire. And I'm really concerned, but I think it's happening before our eyes. I really am scared. I think that what's going to happen is, just as the British Empire tried to justify its imperial domination using the white man's burden, right? Saying that we're the most civilized country and we spread education and literacy, which is a lie. If you look at India, India was colonized for nearly 200 years by the British, and by the time the British left, the illiteracy rate had dropped. The illiteracy rate had skyrocketed, and the country was underdeveloped. It was undeveloped. But anyway, the point is, if you listen to the Obama types, the Hillary Clintons, the Kamala Harrises, the Joe Bidens, they were combining that George H.W. Bush worldview with liberalism. So we're living in a really super important historical moment, but it's also a terrifying moment in so many ways.
Yeah, I agree with you. We survived the last one. I don't know that we can come through this one. Yeah, the future looks dark at the moment. And even though I tend to be, more of a realist, there's a lot of optimist in me as well, and that optimist is really fighting hard right now to hold on. I hate to end it on that kind of a note, but this is a very scary time. There was one point,
I'm actually sorry to cut you off, related on the point of optimism and, the future looking gloom. I forgot to mention one crucial point in this. And this also is one of those ideological fault lines where the Trumpists and the kind of bipartisan neoconservatives disagree. And I think that that's on the issue of Russia. You mentioned that in this new Cold War now, that the new Cold War is against both China and Russia. What's interesting, though, is I think that the Trumpists very clearly don't want, Russiagate is bogus. It's ridiculous conspiracy, obviously. And, my colleague Aaron Mate has spent a lot of time debunking that at the Grayzone. We publish a lot of stuff debunking that. That said, I think it's true. It's obviously ridiculous that Trump colluded with the Russians to win the election. Now, but liberals always say, well, then why doesn't Trump criticize Russia? Why is he pro-Putin and all this? You know, I think that's clearly exaggerated because the Trump administration has done a lot of stuff like tearing up the anti-ballistic missiles agreement with Russia, destroying other peace agreements. So he's by continuing to expand NATO. So yeah, clearly that it's exaggerated. But at the same time, if you listen to Trump's rhetoric, and especially if you look at Steve Bannon, their strategy actually, as awful as these guys are and as evil as they are, again, they're not dumb either. Well, Trump's dumb, but Steve Bannon's not dumb. And the people behind that movement, they recognize that China represents the so-called threat to the U.S. Russia's not really a threat economically in any way. Russia's economy is the size of Italy's. But militarily, Russia is a formidable power, and politically, it has a lot of soft power. But China is the biggest so-called threat, in scare quotes, to the U.S. And the Bannon types have been recognizing that for many years. Bannon, who comes out of the U.S. military, let's not forget, he's fantasized for a long time about containing China. That's his vision in life. He gave a speech actually for a group before the Vatican, a Vatican group that is linked to Opus Dei, because Steve Bannon represents like this kind of fascistic far-right Catholic force. And he gave a speech before Trump entered the White House in which Bannon said that there's a clash of civilizations, but it's not between it's not the clash of civilizations that the war on terror portrayed between the Judeo-Christian West and Muslims. Rather, he said it was between the Judeo-Christian West and China. And there are a lot of forces on the Christian right who agree with that, who see China as this big atheist threat. And then there are the forces who see China as a supposed economic threat. So the clear strategy of the Trumpists was to get Russia to either break with China or to play neutral. And they wanted, ideally, they wanted Russia to join with the West against China. And this is actually a strategy that's not even just of the Trumpists. Henry Kissinger famously wrote and gave some speeches saying that, because Kissinger was the one in the Nixon administration who oversaw the policy of the opening with China. They recognized that with the Sino-Soviet split, that the U.S. could work with China to contain the Soviet Union and overthrow the Soviet Union, and they succeeded. But then Kissinger wrote in some of his books and gave speeches acknowledging that we also realize that after doing that, in the future, we might have to team up with Russia against China. And clearly, that was the strategy of the Bannonites. That, I think, explains why still Trump is soft on Russia, because they still think that they can peel off Russia from China and try to overthrow China and balkanize China and privatize the economy like they did the former Soviet Union. But ironically, it was the Democrats who prevented that vision from ever being accomplished. And I think, ironically, these neoconservative democratic forces, they're the ones who, just as much as Trump, I think, are responsible for the end of the U.S. empire and the rapid decline we're seeing, because the only possibility the U.S. ever had of maintaining its unipolar status was getting Russia over to its side and breaking up China, which is clearly what they want to do. But they can't do it against both China and Russia, because if China and Russia unify, that's Eurasia. And if Eurasia can unify, and I talked earlier about the world island, if Eurasia can unify, it's over, because they can form an independent, not just political bloc, but more importantly, an economic bloc. And we're seeing that happen right now with the Belt and Road Initiative. China is trying to unite all of these countries, not just economically with trade, but physically with infrastructure, and not maritime, but land trade, having a massive new Silk Road connecting Europe, especially Eastern Europe, Western Asia, the Middle East, Central Asia, and Eastern Asia, and then Russia. And that's what's happening right now. And the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is going to be the organization that links it all together. And it was the Democrats that prevented that strategy from coming to fruition. I mean, there's also the possibility it never could have worked. It was always an iffy strategy because Russia clearly has a good alliance with China, but at this point, because of Russiagate, it's never going to happen. And I think that's why we're seeing the new Cold War on both China and Russia. And my real concern is that, there's only two possibilities at this point. There's the possibility of the U.S. empire accepting its decline peacefully and agreeing to return to the status as not a minor power, as still a significant power, but not the world hegemon. That's the ideal situation, and returning to what we call multipolar world order. Of course, I think that's what we should be hoping for. But the other possibility is a new world war, and not just a Cold War, but a military war with China and Russia. And unfortunately, who knows? But I think that's a very real possibility that we should be pushing back against, but that a lot of people in Washington would be happy with.
Yeah, and there's another that is the big fissure in, Russia and China, Eurasia. The other big factor there is Germany, and they've long feared an alliance between Russia and Germany and China. That's undefeatable in their view, and I think there's a big disagreement on how to align to best move forward, and I think that Zbigniew Brzezinski is kind of a good indicator. His last writing, which didn't get much attention, by the way, I think that sort of tips you off as to where some of the big giant disagreements really geopolitically are, because starting in the 90s, of course, and led by the Democrats, there's a large investment in China. There are a lot of people with a big economic ties. China is not just the Communist Party. There are a lot of Chinese oligarchs who are pretty powerful now too. And of course, Germany is trying not to have to pick a side. So I think the Ukraine is when Russia decided that there was no way, that they gave up on the alliance with the West. And it was much too little attention was paid to the Maidan and everything that happened afterwards in Crimea with Russia. But yeah, you could see it coming then, and it's only gotten worse now. And it's caused a major factional divide in this country as well as to how to go forward. So,
well,
yeah, we always end up
in
there.
Belarus right now. In Belarus, we don't have time to get into it, of course. But, sure, people might be angry that Lukashenko has been in power for so long, but it's clearly another color revolution attempt, very similar to Ukraine. And Belarus is not only a major Russian ally, it has a unity state agreement with Russia. And if they can succeed in overthrowing the Belarusian government, that is yet another country on Russia's border that is going to be part of the NATO-EU alliance. And it's part of the strategy of trying to contain Russia so they can eventually try to overthrow China, because they can't do both at the same time. But we'll see what happens in Belarus. It's not looking likely, because Russia's not going to allow another Ukraine to happen. But you made a really important point about Germany. There's this website, War on the Rocks, which is run by a lot of former NatSec officials, a lot of veterans and people in Washington, D.C. think tanks. And it's definitely not an anti-imperialist website at all, the opposite. But it's an interesting website because they're smart people who speak openly. They don't speak in these liberal platitudes about human rights, and that's all the PR. The website is for other people who work in those circles and who want to actually know the facts and the geopolitics. And I listen to their podcast sometime because it's very revealing. And they had a podcast talking about War on the Rocks, talking about the weakening in some ways of the NATO alliance because of Trump. And what's interesting is they kept repeating, in that these are former U.S. military officials. They kept repeating a lot, especially a lot of Obama people, former Obama administration officials. They kept repeating that NATO is about keeping Germany down and the West together, because they recognize that if Germany is not kept down if Germany has its own independent foreign policy, and especially if Germany remilitarizes, that they can't keep it. They can't keep the EU together, and they can't
and
keep NATO
aligns
together.
with Russia and China. And aligns
Absolutely.
with Russia and China, right?
Just from a matter of geopolitics, and which is also why the U.S. right now is threatening to sanction the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, because they recognize that because just look at a map, Germany has every reason to have good relations with Russia.
Exactly.
And so that's the gear. And of course, if Germany goes, that's the end of the European Union, because Germany, the agreement that was made with these policymakers overseeing the U.S. empire after the end of the Cold War, the agreement was, okay, we're going to make this European Union thing, by the way. And by the way, the European Union, the movement to create the European Union, we now know there have been many leaked documents showing that the CIA had a very important role, U.S. intelligence forces, in encouraging the creation of the European Union, because the agreement was the European Union is Germany's property, effectively. I mean, France helps, but Germany's in charge economically. So, and Germany economically benefits the most from the European Union, with France in a close second. So if Germany looks east, that's the end of the European Union. And the idea that all of these Western European countries are going to look across the Atlantic Ocean to the U.S. is insane. No, they have every reason to look over to the Middle East and to Asia. So I think this is the fundamental split we're seeing, and the Trump era has really just made it so clear. The neoliberal forces in the Democratic Party, who are embracing this neoconservative foreign policy, they recognize that NATO and this system that was created toward the end of the Cold War and after is in a very fragile moment right now, and it's on the verge of breaking. And if Trump wins another 4 years, it might actually break. So they're trying to do everything they can to prevent that system from breaking. But even if Biden's president, and I think Trump's probably going to win again, but even if Biden somehow wins, who knows if they can keep it together? I don't think it's likely.
Yeah, another, we don't have time to talk about it, but another person who tells the story about the original plans, he tells it in economic terms, is Yanis Varoufakis in his Global Minotaur lectures and his book. So maybe we can talk about that sometime. We both have the same core interest, which is empire, and so we always end up there, huh, Ben?
No, I mean, thanks a lot for letting me rant about this stuff, because this is a lot of stuff I read and think about a lot. But, when I do interviews, they tend to be more newsy interviews, so I don't get to dig into geopolitics. So, yeah, I mean, I think when we just take a step back and look, these are the historical shifts we're living through. And, as important as it is to talk about Bolivia and Nicaragua and the crimes of the empire right now, it's also important every once in a while to take a step back and look at the long-term trajectory, because that's not discussed enough.
Yeah, big picture. That's what I didn't have for so many years. I didn't even know we were an empire. So, big picture is really, really important and hard to figure out. But once you do sort of have it figured out, then things make a lot more sense.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say, you mentioned the economics. I am not in any way prepared to talk about the economics. I'm not qualified to do that. But I will say that you mentioned Yanis Varoufakis. He has some very interesting writings. I would recommend the best economist to understand the new economics of imperialism and all of this is Michael Hudson. Yeah, Michael Hudson is a genius at explaining. I look at it mostly from the political angle as a journalist and from the military angle. But Michael Hudson, in his books, explains the economic angle and how the U.S. dollar is used to keep all this empire together. So I would recommend interviewing him. He's brilliant, and anyone listening, you should read Michael Hudson's books, because it's really influenced me a lot.
Yeah, I've been meaning to try to get him for an interview, but I'm going to need to do some reading before I do it too. So, but listen, Ben, I don't want to run out of almost every minute that you had to spare for this interview. So please tell everybody how to find your work, how to support your work.
Yeah, you can find me at thegrayzone.com, and that's gray with an A. And I'm on Twitter, of course. Just look up Ben Norton. I'm at Benjamin Norton. And thanks a lot for having me. I mean, this is a great podcast. I'm always happy to be here.
Yeah, I have a feeling we could have done double this amount of time.
Next time.
Yeah. All right. Take care, Ben. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening. A special thanks to Ben Norton. Follow Ben on Twitter at Benjamin Norton. Find his work at the Grayzone. And subscribe to his podcast, Moderate Rebels. Around the Empire podcast, independent media, and your support's really important. Please pitch in at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. There are lots of ways to listen to this syndicated audio podcast on any mobile podcast app, on the website aroundtheempire.com, on Patreon, or on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Also follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.